History tells the story of the world and of our lives. Sometimes that history goes bump in the night. Broadcasting from the center of oddity and the supernatural in Central Florida, it's the History Goes Bump podcast.
Hello, you spooktacular people. Welcome to History Goes Bump Redux. I am your host, Diane.
And this is Kelly.
Kelly, on this episode, we're going back to a location that we covered in 2015 down in Australia. This is Port Arthur.
In the way, way back machine.
It is. This has got a very interesting history. It was a jail, and then it had a horrible mass shooting there. And now there are spirits left behind. Are you ready to go back?
I'm ready. Port Arthur is part of a World Heritage Site featuring former Australian jail sites, and it is an open-air museum. Australia has a harsh history since it was established as a place for Britain to send her convicts. Many of the prisoners from Ireland's Kilmainham jail were sent to Australia. Port Arthur's prison became the stop for Britain's worst convicts. Such a harsh place would be a good breeding ground for things that go bump in the night just for its penal history alone. But this area has an even more tragic story. As Diane said, it was the site of a massacre in 1996. No wonder Port Arthur is considered to be one of the most haunted locations in all the world.
"12,000 years ago, the oceans were rising due to the melt-off from the Ice Age. This rising of the oceans changed the geography of Australia and cut off one area of the continent that we know today as Tasmania. The Aboriginal people who had lived there were cut off from the other Aboriginal people, and they developed uniquely, both culturally and physically. They became known as Tasmanians, and by the time Europeans arrived to settle, the Tasmanians had 9 distinct ethnic groups. The British originally settled the area in 1803. Within 30 years, only 300 of the Tasmanians still survived, having dwindled from a population that some have estimated to be 10,000. The survivors were relocated to Flinders Island.
The capital city of Tasmania is Hobart, and it was established in 1804 by British Lieutenant Governor David Collins. In 1830, Port Arthur was established as a timber station. It was named for Lieutenant Governor George Arthur. The harshest criminals formed the population of the penal settlement, and they set up several types of manufacturing, which ranged from shipbuilding to shoemaking to brickmaking and even flour milling. The shipbuilding was very successful, and the settlement produced 15 large ships and 140 smaller vessels. The prisoners sent to Port Arthur were reoffenders who had been shipped over to mainland Australia. Port Arthur was the perfect location for a prison for these reoffenders because of several factors. The only land route to the mainland was over a 30-meter-wide isthmus that was heavily guarded, and the waters surrounding the area were shark-infested. The prison there was sold as being inescapable.
Some prisoners did try to escape. One such prisoner was George Billy Hunt, who dressed as a kangaroo and tried to hop across the isthmus.
No way. Are you kidding me? Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
I'm trying to figure out. It's not like he had a kangaroo costume we got down at the local shop. Anyway, he kind of got...
Did he put on the dead skin of one?
Oh, God, maybe. I didn't even think about it. Oh,
that's where my head went.
Guards shot at him, and he was returned to the prison and given 150 lashes, so I guess that wasn't worth it. Martin Cash and 2 other prisoners were more successful, and they did escape. Cash was a bushranger, meaning he had survival skills to live in the bush, and committed armed robbery. He actually escaped twice from Port Arthur. He later had a ghostwriter write about his adventures in the book, The Adventures of Martin Cash, published in 1870.
In 1848, the separate prison was built. With the addition of this prison came a new era in punishment. Previously, the punishment had been corporal, but now punishment moved to psychological. It was so harsh it drove many insane. Good prisoners were given luxury items like tea and sugar, while bad prisoners were given only bread and water. This prison also used the silent system that we have talked about on other podcasts, where prisoners were not allowed to speak at all and they were hooded. Point Pure was set up as a place for juvenile offenders. Some of them were as young as 9 years old. The juveniles were expected to do the same work as the adults. A church was built and all prisoners were forced to attend.
In 1863, the Paupers Depot was built, followed by the construction of the asylum. The population of Port Arthur was aging and getting sick, and these were part of Port Arthur's welfare phase, but it was anything but good for the convicts. Treatment was rudimentary, and most of the patients continued to suffer from depression and mental instability. The asylum later became a school and a town hall after it was damaged by a bushfire. Industry began to halt at Port Arthur because of the aging population, and in 1877 it was closed. At its closing, the Isle of the Dead, where prisoners who had died were buried, contained 1,646 graves. Only 180 remained marked. Tourists began to visit soon after the closure.
Much of the property was auctioned off, and the buildings deteriorated. Many were torn down and were damaged in fires. In 1916, the Scenery Preservation Board took over management of the area, and in the 1970s, the National Parks and Wildlife Service took over. It was at this time that restoration and cleanup began. Today, the museum includes the model prison, the guard tower, the church, and parts of the main penitentiary. Guided tours are offered as well as ghost tours, but this is not where Port Arthur's tragic history ends. In 1996, the third deadliest mass shooting spree in the world occurred at Port Arthur. The murderer was Martin Bryant. Bryant was born in Tasmania in 1967. Bryant is what one would deem a bad seed. He was difficult and angry from the very beginning. He would break his toys and rage in fits. He once snatched the snorkel from another boy while they were diving. Teachers described him as distant and a poor student. He tortured animals as well. After his arrest, he was found to have an IQ of 66. Bryant often was depressed and became an alcoholic. In early April of 1996, Bryant bought a large bag he would later use during the massacre.
On the morning of April 28, 1996, Bryant went to the Seascape Bed and Breakfast and killed owners David and Sally Martin. He blamed them for causing his father's depression and suicide because they bought the B&B out from under his father. He ate a meal at the Broad Arrow Cafe at the Port Arthur Historical Site. After eating, he set up a video camera and went to the back of the cafe where he pulled out a Colt AR-15 SP-1 carbine, and he began shooting. He killed 12 and wounded 10 there. He walked to the other side of the shop and killed 8 and wounded 2 more people. He changed magazines and fled in his car, shooting people along the road, killing 4 more and wounding 6. He came upon a mother with 2 children. He fired, killing the mother and 1 child while the other ran. He chased her down and killed her. I mean, this guy is
terrible.
Thick. He carjacked a BMW and killed its 4 occupants. He stopped another car and killed a female occupant and forced a man to get into the trunk of the BMW. Bryant returned to the Seascape B&B with his hostage, and a standoff ensued. He killed the hostage, set fire to the B&B, hoping to escape in the chaos, and was finally arrested. He was sentenced to 35 life sentences plus 1,035 years without parole and is in a psychiatric wing of Risdon Prison in Hobart, Tasmania. In the end, he had killed 35 people and injured 23.
My word. One can imagine that a history as a harsh penal colony and the site of a massacre would lead to hauntings, and it does. The site offers night ghost tours every day, except Christmas Day, which we have heard are fantastic. In 1840, Private Robert Young drowned near the jetty cabin, and tourists report seeing a man with straight black hair and a ruffled white shirt in or near the cabin. The parsonage is one of the first stops on the tour, and is considered the most haunted place on the site. Reverend George Eastman died in the upstairs bedroom, but the stairs were difficult to navigate, so his coffin was lowered by rope out of the window.
You gotta be real careful while you're doing that. You don't want to dump a body.
No kidding. During the lowering, his coffin burst open and his body fell into the gutter below.
As I was saying, you don't want to dump a body.
That's unfortunate.
Oops.
Maybe this undignified exit from his home promoted his haunting of the place. He was barely settled into the ground before people started reporting smelling rotting flesh, hearing unearthly moans, and seeing strange bright lights inside the parsonage. The study seems particularly prone to lights, while the guest bedroom has been problematic too. A lady guest was driven from the room by unexplained knocking coming from the walls and floor. And as she fled up the stairs, she heard the patter of feet running behind her. Oh no.
Yeah, no running up behind me. We
No.
talked about that before.
Also in this room, a servant shrieked and collapsed one day while checking the fire. After waking, she said she had seen a man standing outside the window looking at her, holding a knife as though he was about to strike her. In 2004, a young girl and her mother were standing at the garden gate when they saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway to the house watching them.
The following account was printed in 1893 in the Clipper newspaper under the headline, The Haunted Parsonage. On one particular night, Mrs. Price was unable to sleep. Suddenly, she became conscious that somebody had entered her room, and glancing towards the door, beheld a human figure draped in white. Her first thought was to make a move or to speak, but it struck her that the intruder might be a burglar in disguise, intent upon robbing her of the jewel case, because lots of burglars dress as ghosts, and that to attract attention to herself might possibly mean something serious against her life. She therefore lay motionless, but with half-open eyes followed the movements of the supposed burglar. The mysterious figure, having entered the room, went through the motion of striking a match upon the wall, and immediately afterwards there was the appearance of light as from a lucifer. I don't know what that means, but this done, it then made its way round the foot of the bed to a cot in which one of the children slept. For a moment it stood looking at the sleeping child, then turning around, glided silently out of the room and was gone.
The church bells sometimes ring for no reason around 6 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, attributed to the ghost of Joseph Shuttleworth, who was murdered by fellow convict William Riley as they worked on the church construction. In the junior medical officer's house, ghost children are often heard playing on the roof, running around, rattling windows, and moving furniture.
Why are there any children playing on the roof?
Or moving furniture.
Is that why they're ghost children? Because they were playing on the roof?
Could be. The Commandant's house is home to the nanny chair, which rocks on its own and whose ghostly occupant touches unwary visitors.
Now, what kind of touching is this? It's the nanny chair? Does it spank people
Oh, dear.
when they come in or smack you upside the head?
Nanny might be like a granny, though. You never know.
Oh, I guess.
Because they used to call the Staffordshire Terriers nanny dogs. So,
Your
maybe
grandmother, you don't think would ever have spanked you?
No.
I don't think
I
my
was-
grandmothers ever did either, but...
I was my grandma's favorite.
Oh. So there.
Faces appear in the holes in the walls of the dissection room under the senior surgeon's house. Of course, the separate prison is home to all manner of ghosts and apparitions, including a screaming boy awaiting execution, depressed and anxious feelings in the cell of a convict who committed suicide, and mysterious lights in the dark punishment cells.
God, I would hate to hear that boy screaming, waiting for execution.
I know.
What were they executing a boy about? And now a little break for a word about one of our sponsors. Andrea Allison's website, paranormalstories.blogspot.com, has the following account. The very location of Port Arthur Cemetery has its own paranormal reports. A prisoner named Mark Jeffrey, serving time for manslaughter, lived on the island in a little hut as the resident gravedigger. One morning, a signal fire caught the eye of the authorities and a boat was sent over to retrieve Jeffrey. He returned to the mainland with an unbelievable tale. The night before, his hut had been shaken and rocked by an invisible force, and a fiery red glow had lit up the walls and surrounding ground. Upon investigation, he was confronted by a creature with eyes smoldering, horns erect, and encircled by sulfurous smoke. Speaking of Lucifer.
Yeah, no kidding.
No one took his experience serious, but visitors have felt an oppressive atmosphere on the island of the dead. Talk about a haunted cemetery. Yee, don't want to run into that thing.
P. Clifford shared his personal story on the website castleofspirits.com about a tour he was on and something they saw. One of the fellow tourists had left to use the restroom before this event occurred, and here is what happened.
We had been there not that long, but long enough so that the guy would have been able to have rejoined the group. We were laughing and joking that a ghost had taken him when we saw someone at the end of the path, about 150 meters away, that had trees dotted on either side of it. The tour guide called out to quote-unquote him as we were in a dark spot, and he may not have spotted us. I had my video camera with which I was able to see in the dark to some degree, and as I zoomed in on him, The figure walked behind a tree and stopped. We were all calling out and had no response. The guide then spoke on her walkie-talkie to see if it was another guide, who may be playing a joke on us, but no one was near us. The guide then went down to see what it was, and she found no one there. It's pretty cool because they all saw it. She then rejoined the group, and we then entered the building, looking around the place, and then finished our tour. After, when we went back, we found the gentleman sitting having a coffee, and of course the first question was, "So was that you?" He looked at us like we were mad, and then said that he had found the toilet and decided to head back to the main building and wait for us there. And our group was left suddenly wondering who our visitor was.
Indeed.
And who's on a tour and just goes, "I'm going to go to the bathroom and get a coffee and then I'm done."
I mean, what is wrong with that chap?
I guess we have had people when we're doing ghost tours that leave halfway through and you're like, what in the world? They just break off and go and do their own thing. It's like, you did pay for this, so...
Maybe it wasn't spooky enough, although he would have gotten a little bit of a spook fest going on if he had been there to witness the guy.
That's true.
Freya Porter had joined the podcast on the original episode, and she shared her personal story. The parsonage is of special interest to me because it's where I had my brief ghostly experience in 2010. I went to Tasmania on a school trip when I was 12, and one of the places we visited was Port Arthur after having studied it in history class. Our teachers organized for us to go on the ghost tour at 8 p.m. in the dead of winter, which we all joked about until we actually got on the tour itself. The parsonage was the second stop after the church. We'd already visited the building earlier in the tour and had no problems. It's a very peaceful-looking building in the daytime, surrounded by a pretty flower garden with a little winding path from the garden gate to the veranda. I was near the front of the group. The guide held up the lantern and asked one of us kids to open the garden gate for him. I put my hand on the gate and was about to push the gate open when I felt a presence holding me back. It didn't want me going into that house. I stepped back, insisting that we couldn't go in there. Whatever was in that house, good or bad, didn't want us there. The guide ignored me, and the group left me and another teacher outside the gate while they spent 10 minutes inside the house. I would not cross the gate, trying to tell the teacher that there really was something there that wasn't happy about the intrusions. He seemed sympathetic, at least. He didn't like the vibes around that place either. The group came out unscathed, however, and the tour continued without any more ghostly occurrences.
When my class got back to school the next term and brought our photos in to share, we noticed something strange in one of my teacher's photos of a house. He couldn't remember which it was, but it was definitely a residence, not a prison complex, in the daytime. In one of the windows, the side profile of a woman can be seen with her hands held near her face like she's praying or crying. We had no idea what to make of it. There's reports of the Lady Blue who died in childbirth hanging around the parsonage or accountant's house, but we have no idea if it was her or not.
A guide on one of the ghost tours told the guests about something that happened to an archaeologist on the property. The guide said that there was a convict who killed himself in the solitary confinement prison by using the hammock strings to hang himself. He did so by attaching the string to a pipe close to the ground and sat forward, pulling the string against his neck. Apparently, about 30 years ago, a group of archaeologists were working at Port Arthur, and one of them decided to enter the solitary confinement prison by herself. Soon after, she was found in the same cell as where the convict hanged himself, rocking back and forth. Once her colleagues got her out of there, she recounted that she felt a strong presence walk into that cell, and after that, doesn't remember anything.
Mom Metal said on Reddit, "Okay, here's my story back in 2003. My family went to Tasmania for a holiday and we decided to visit Port Arthur during the day, not the night tour. At the time, I was 7 years old, but this moment has stuck with me for life. As we were going around and seeing all the old prison cells, I decided to look into one of them through the little windows on the doors on my left side. As I peered through, I saw an old man in a brown suit with a brown hat and a brown tie and black dress shoes just sitting by himself on a wooden chair, looking at me with a piercing gaze. As a 7-year-old, I quickly turned and yelled out to my parents to come and see. As I turned back to look into the room again, the man had vanished, which shook me." Leonie Vanderveen wrote on the BNE.com website in 2018 about a haunting encounter her son had at Port Arthur. "This was not a happy place for many, and as an adult, I'm empathetic to events and situations I've not personally experienced. However, what I did not account for was the intense reaction my 7-year-old son had during our visit." Uh-oh, here we have another 7-year-old.
Ruh-roh.
"Not yet of the age at which I thought it necessary to provide a detailed history of Port Arthur. As far as he was aware, we were just looking at a bunch of old buildings. At first, he was inquisitive, happy to skip beside us as we explored the old church, government cottage and gardens, but his mood changed dramatically when he refused to cross the threshold of the parsonage, reputedly one of the most haunted buildings in Australia. Over the next 30 minutes, my son's emotions intensified as he became teary and extremely difficult, clenching his fists by his side as he moved unwillingly from site to site, refusing to enter any structures. He was unable to articulate what his problem was other than saying, "I'm just angry," over and over again. Thinking this was a rare and by his usual standards a particularly odd tantrum, we persisted with our visit. We could not, however, ignore him when he began pacing in a circle near the chilling separate prison, intermittently growling under his breath. This is a 7-year-old.
Good grief.
The prison had been built for the physical, mental, and sensory isolation of unruly convicts, truly hell on earth for those unlucky enough to wind up there. By this time, my son was attracting the attention of others with his distressed growling and pacing. I bundled him in my arms, imploring him to tell me what was wrong, but his response was forced and stilted. "I am trying to keep the mad in." That was enough for us to finish our visit and head for the exit at the Port Arthur Visitor Center. Our little boy, seemingly racked with grief, holding back tears and growling all the way. Rather exasperated, our day had been cut short by what I thought must have been a tired, hungry, or bored child. I certainly was not expecting and cannot explain what happened next. The moment we stepped through the doors into the recently built center, I immediately felt my son's vice-like grip release in my hand as he halted, closed his eyes, and let out a huge sigh that made him slump forward. Bent over with hands on his knees, he took a few more deep breaths, then looked up and said, "I feel better now. All the mad is gone away." And that was it. In a blink, my gentle, happy, and amicable child was back. If his sudden recovery had occurred anywhere else, I may not have made any connection to a possible emotional haunting, but my fears were confirmed when a Port Arthur staff member mentioned accounts of similar reactions from visitors, along with visual, physical, and sensory encounters. It rocked us to the core when we also discovered the area our son was anxiously pacing around was the very spot of a brutal solitary confinement cell once used to house the worst of the worst tortured souls in convict days. Spirits of broken men whose legacies remain in the physical ruins and the unsettling energy cloaking the otherwise exquisite setting that is Port Arthur. We feel you.
My goodness.
I mean, talk about a kid who definitely has got some kind of empath in him. He was picking up on something big time. Holy cow.
Absolutely.
And it must have been frightening for her because it sounds like her kid's usually laid back and sweet.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, he's like drawing enough attention that she's like, okay, we're making a scene. Let's get him out of here. Right. Why are you growling and I mean, I can't imagine watching a 7-year-old growling and pacing. That is the strangest tantrum I've ever heard of.
Exactly. Port Arthur has nearly 2 centuries of documented history and tales, many of them haunted in nature. Do the spirits of former prisoners still roam the grounds? Can so many personal experiences just be hallucinations? Did Freya really feel something disturbing?
That is for you to decide. Well, if any of you have been to Port Arthur and had any experiences, let us know. It looks like a really cool place to check out. A lot of the buildings now are in ruins and that kind of thing, but you know us, we love old prisons, so this would be right up our alley.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you guys for joining us for this Redux. I've been your host, Diane.
And this has been Kelly.
You take care now.
Bye-bye.
And you know, one of the things that's been left behind is the Tasmanian devil.
It has?
Yeah. I loved those cartoons.
Well, they actually were an animal.
I know they were. I'm talking about the cartoon character. The other ones, they're adorable, aren't they? The little Tasmanian devils. You do some amazing impressions, Kelly. Where'd you pull that out of?
Never mind. I think you're probably the only one that thinks so, darling. But thank you.
I think our listeners appreciate your impressions too.
Just let it fly. The harshest criminals formed the population of the penal sediment.
Sediment? Penal sediment.
Settled.
They're a bunch of sand.
And they settled deep in the core of the rock.
On the morning of April 28th, 1996, Bryant went to the Seascape Bread and Breakfast.
I mean,
They
is
do
it French
usually
toast?
have bread when they
French
have
toast or
breakfast.
just toast? White or wheat? Or rye?